Happy Sunday. Last week, we talked about Moses, a prophet who preceded Christ and in some cosmologies predicted and predicated Christ's mission. So this week, I thought instead of going forward, I was kind of called to go backward. Um, so, we would have gone from Moses to, other prophets that then came between him and Christ, and there were a few options there, John the Baptist, for instance. But I wanted to kind of run even further back. Christ as a historical figure is fairly well agreed on. While there can be debate about how accurate the Gospels are or how accurately they portray Jesus, most historians have decided to agree that Jesus was an actual person of cultural significance. I'm not really weighing in on that. That's what historians say. Then that becomes less true with Moses, which I'm again not actually weighing in on, even though I say it becomes less true. Outside of Scripture, there's not really a lot of solid evidence of Moses as a historical figure. He just exists as in Scripture. That's about the only way we've got records of Moses. Now, rabbinical tradition placed the life of Moses somewhere around 1350 BCE. Now, that's not all traditions, but that is a rabbinical tradition, meaning Jewish tradition. It says that Moses existed around 1350 BCE. Coincidentally, around that time, there was an Egyptian pharaoh named Akhenaten, whose statues marked him as looking very different from other Egyptian pharaohs, so possibly a different race or something was going on there. And Akhenaten, he did kind of start what could be termed a monotheistic revolution against the Egyptian ruling theology and priests of the time. So maybe he's our Moses. Maybe that is our historical Moses. Maybe not. So we've got Christ fairly, well agreed on as a historical figure. We've got Moses. There's some things maybe he is, maybe he isn't. It's harder to tell. So it's no surprise that when we go back even further, things get even more muddled. Enoch is a biblical figure who lived before the great flood, and he's our prophet this Sunday. So Enoch is even further back than Noah. Enoch exists before the great flood. Now, so Moses, we're going to place it like 1350 BCE. Christ, of course, is 0 or 33 CE, that region, right? Moses is 1350. Well, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which detailed the Great Flood, dates to maybe 2700 BCE. And I found some dates that said it was even maybe as old as 3300 BCE. And then in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I know this is a lot, but I think it's kind of interesting. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Noah, or the figure that we kind of equate with Noah, has already been alive for like 1,000 years after the flood. So that would mean if Gilgamesh is set around 3300 BCE, when that really was when it was probably a story. Like, I'm not just saying it's set then, that's when people told this tale. If that was then the flood would have had to have been like 4500 BCE or earlier. Interestingly, totally separate from this little timeline I just outlined that I just got from just kind of looking. I found a report from ABC News that Robert Ballard, a leading underwater archaeologist, claimed that there was a flooding event that was epic in proportions around 5000 BCE. My understanding was that it had to do with rising sea levels from ice caps and things. So that's kind of fun that those timelines line up to some extent. So somewhere around 5000 BCE, there was this flood. The Epic of Gilgamesh arguably puts the flood somewhere around that time period. Kind of interesting. But again, we're not focusing on Noah. We're focusing on Enoch. I'm just trying to place how far back this is. And just highlight the point I made, that these memories and prophets kind of do have these historical touchstones, but they warp and they evolve, and you know, I don't want to say change, but they have something separate from the records we have. How about we say it that way? And I want to point out that Enoch goes back even further than Noah. So if Noah's 5000 BCE, Enoch's even earlier. Now in 5000 BCE, there were about 40 million human beings worldwide. I find that kind of fascinating. There were 40 million people on Earth around 5000 BCE. So, I mean, roughly, that's like the population of the general New York City, LA, and Chicago areas combined, right? Each of those has 15 million-ish. And so you combine those together, you get in the range of 40 million-ish. So if you can think of New York, LA, and Chicago, the general area populations combined, that's everybody on the earth. And I'm fascinated by that, in that it's so many, not that it's so little. 5000 BCE, so far back. Christ, we're only 2000 years from Christ. Think about that. And this Noah and the flood is 5,000 years before Christ. If we go from this timeline, even if we don't, 5,000 years before Christ, there were still 40 million human beings worldwide. That's a secular stat. That's not something I found on any kind of church site. It's interesting. And Enoch was even 1,000 years before this Noah. So if we're still kind of sticking with this timeline, that puts him at like 6,000 BCE. And the world population went through a burst right after 5000 BC. So it still would have been about that same amount of people. Enoch's only mentioned briefly in the canonical Bible. It's around Genesis 5. It says Enoch walked faithfully with God. And we're told that mankind pre-flood were kind of, they weren't very faithful. There's all that like wickedness and sin and those kinds of things. But Enoch was somebody that walked with God. And Jude, later in the New Testament, Jude says Enoch prophesied about the contemporary at the time of the Bible, of the like authoring of the Epistle of Jude, contemporary people to him, to Jude. And according to Genesis 5, Enoch lived 365 years. So that's another little piece we get. And in Hebrews 11, Enoch's faith, it says Enoch's faith pleased God. And that's about it for the biblical Enoch, the Enoch of the just standard, good old-fashioned Bible. However, there are 3 non-canonical books of Enoch. Not many traditions respect those. One of the bigger ones is Beta Israel, which if you've never looked them up, B-E-T-A, Beta, if you prefer that pronunciation, some of my UK people do. But Beta Israel, they are an Ethiopian group of Jews, dark-skinned, Ethiopian-looking people, so kind of different than like the European Jews we're more used to seeing, or even like the Israeli Jews. But they claim a long lineage. They actually claim to have the Ark of the Covenant. So Beta Israel is interesting to look up if you've never looked at it. Actually, I think it's the Coptic Church in Ethiopia that does, but they're kind of connected. So Beta Israel respects the 3 books of Enoch. Closer to home, in the Restoration faiths, we have the Joseph Smith inspired edition of the Bible. Now, most of my viewers are at least passingly familiar with the Restoration, but a few of you aren't. a few of the people that I know that I speak to. And so to kind of just quickly gloss over, the Joseph Smith inspired a version of the Bible, which I talked about a little last week, I believe, is a version where he worked through a Bible, and then as he was called, he kind of revised or corrected or added pieces that were prophecy from him. Later, after Joseph Smith's passing, after his martyrdom, the church around the 1850s started, they pulled some of the sections from the inspired edition, which the LDS church didn't actually own it. That wound up going to Community of Christ. But they started pulling sections, the LDS church did. And eventually they came up with this, which is the Pearl of Great Price. And the Pearl of Great Price includes the Book of Moses, which takes huge chunks from the inspired edition of the Old Testament that Joseph Smith worked on. And it's an interesting thing about it. So there's the Book of Moses. So this is LDS scripture. And an interesting thing about it is that there are heavy parallels between it and the books of Enoch, which I think is really interesting. There's different theories on why. Obviously, not everybody accepts that it's prophetic coincidence or something, or coincidence isn't the word I'm even looking for, but prophetic call that they're the same. I mean, there's, just like all of it, there's theories, but I think it's really interesting. So to an extent, the books of Enoch do speak to an LDS understanding of scripture and of the world. The first book of Enoch's kind of the most substantial, and it's divided into 5 sections. There's the Book of Watchers, which talks about, it kind of harkens to Genesis 6, where they talk about like fallen angels who sleep with the daughters of men, and they father the Nephilim. And you see the Nephilim mentioned on like ancient astronaut stuff all the time on the History Channel. And there, sometimes Goliath is said to have been a Nephilim, and they're supposed to be like, superheroes basically, or supervillains. Then the second section of the Book of Enoch is the Book of Parables. And it's paralleled in the Book of Moses and talks about the vast quantities of worlds and angels that God ministers to. And apparently some of it touches on to stuff that was repeated in the Book of Revelation. So we kind of see, like we did with Moses, these hints of the overarching messianic mission of Christ, the atonement and all of it being prophesied early. Then it moves on to the Book of Journeys, which focuses like literally on the heavens, on like the movement of the stars and this sort of astrology type thing. And then we go back to Noah, and also Enoch. He goes forward to Noah. Enoch foretells of the coming of Noah and these other events in the history of Israel, which at the time is not really a thing, right? All the way up to the Maccabean revolt, which is like what Hanukkah is based on, right? So truly prophecy in the way we think of it. And then it ends with the Epistle of Enoch, which contains a list of things like live good life and do good things, and your usual. And Enoch kind of recounts the lessons and wisdom he's learned in life, and that ultimately he says we are all subjects of God. So it's a really fascinating book, and there's 2 more beyond, and fun to dive into, even though it's kind of a bit extracurricular or non-canonical. I kind of think that it's fun to look at. And of course, more canonical, we do have the Book of Moses, which I don't believe Community of Christ sustains. Well, certainly don't sustain the Pearl of Great Price in any way. because that was created later. That was after Joseph Smith and after the different denominations of the Restoration started to kind of break off. But I'm not sure about the inspired edition of the Bible. So the things that make up the Book of Moses, I'm not sure how canonical those are for Community of Christ. But it's still interesting, I think, just to dive into. Yeah, and so I don't have a ton here this week. Like, I just kind of wanted to explore that. I wanted to explore Enoch, and I wanted to explore talking about these prophets. And I think it's so fascinating how they kind of echo over time, right? We see similar stories retold, and you can look at it as a line of God working in the same ways each time, if you want to take them as literal history. And so God is calling these prophets and having them work the same ways and telling them the same things. You can definitely take it that way. And it doesn't negate anything to also take it as this is a calling within us, right? The things that are right and the things that are wrong, some change. This year it's illegal for people under 21 to drink, but if you went back in time 40 years, pardon me, there's an engine out there, but if you went back in time like 40 years, it wouldn't be illegal for people under 21 to drink, right? So those little things change, but some of the big touchstones, some of the big truths, we retell those, and we've been retelling those potentially since like 6,000 BCE, which is just, it's such a huge number that it's mind-blowing. There were 40 million people, the populations of New York, LA, Chicago combined, that many people existing 8,000 years ago. 8,000 years blows my mind. That's so much. And then here we are 8,000 years later talking about Enoch, and whatever source you feel like the Book of Moses came from, it does touch things that are in the Book of Enoch, so that scripturally that still comes to us. And the Book of Enoch is legitimately an old scripture, at least a couple thousand years old, potentially 8,000, based on stories 8,000 years old. And think about that. Just think about how these stories get told, and they influence us and they change us. And of course, we're building towards the greatest story ever told, so it's called. I hope that you all have a wonderful week this week. I'm so happy to get to do these messages. They enrich me so much to read about these things and invite me to revisit these scriptures. God bless. Have a wonderful week.